What's one word you associate with grief?
Sad.
Loss.
Depression.
Sadness. Death.
Losing someone or something important to you.
Tough.
Pity.
Heartbreak.
Remorse.
What is one word you associate with guilt?
Shame.
Stress.
Pressure.
Worrisome.
Sadness.
Stress.
Blame.
I would say expectations.
This is Mental Health Mondays.
Today we're talking about guilt and grief.
We can talk about these two G words, guilt and grief, however we want. But in order to start the conversation, we should do our homework and define them. Guilt is defined by Cambridge Dictionary as a self-conscious emotion characterized by a painful appraisal of having done or thought something that is wrong. But let's break that down into bite-sized pieces. Guilt is anxiety and or unhappiness brought about by having done or thought to have done something wrong. Now let's talk about grief. Grief is defined by, grief is often defined in relation to death in common English dictionaries. Let's scratch that idea for today. Grief is a strong, sometimes overwhelming emotion caused by the loss of someone or something deeply cared about. Thanks for watching, and let's get back to the episode.
Okay, I guess when I'm thinking of guilt or feeling guilty, oftentimes there's possibly an overthinking of maybe something good that happened or possibly something bad that happened, a feeling maybe that you should have done more or could have done more, maybe didn't, but then you end up just mulling it over and having that overwhelming feeling of guilt.
This is an interview with Katrina from the Compassionate Grief Center.
I am a grief counselor here at the Compassionate Grief Center, and although I primarily deal with grief and loss, I touch on everything: anxiety, depression. It's a mixed bag.
What is the most common reason people would consult with you here at the Grief Center?
Mostly, a lot of my clients that I work with are dealing with grief and loss specific to the death of a loved one.
With that, do people consult you to grieve things aside from the death of a person?
Absolutely. So a lot of clients that I meet with as well could be experiencing the loss of a relationship, a breakup, a divorce. I've even worked with families that are dealing with loved ones going through addiction, having to set boundaries, estranged relationships, all that counts within the realm of grief and loss.
And what sort of coping strategies do you present to your clients?
That's a good question. So I like to say that each individual is very much unique in their grieving style. Some examples I can probably give that I usually work with clients on is expressing their grief, whether it's through writing, painting, creative expression, grieving rituals like creating memory boxes, writing grief journals, writing a grief letter. These are all kind of coping skills that I utilize. I've also used techniques like mindfulness, setting intentions, and actively processing grief through emotional work as well.
As the last question that we have here, are there any misconceptions you've noticed surrounding grieving and grief counseling, either from your clients or people in general?
Absolutely. I always like to tell people that we as a society are very much grief illiterate. So we get a lot of clients, families, individuals coming in here thinking that, grief has a start and a finish line, meaning we go through stages and they're coming here to work through the stages of grief. Doesn't usually work that way. There are many different aspects of grief. Some people will be going through multiple stages or just one stage or all the stages at the same time. So having a belief that grief is something that needs to be fixed or a wand can be waved or there's a linear process isn't necessarily accurate. So we get a lot of that here at the Grief Center, and it's always an interesting conversation to have with clients that, your grief journey is your own and there's no right, no wrong. It's just authentically you.
Well, thank you, Kat, for your time, and I hope that was helpful to our folks at Hampton High School.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Bye.
When I think of guilt, I think of, one time I lied about eating an entire carton of cookies and I blamed it on my friend. And I still feel guilty to this day. It was actually the biggest fight I ever had with my parents. They were so disappointed in me. And I still can't even, the brand of cookies was Fudgios, and I ate the entire thing of it. But it wasn't over it wasn't just like one day, it was over a span of like 3 days, but still for like, I don't know, it wasn't great. And then I lied about it, and then I don't, yeah, they still don't trust me. And I'm not allowed to buy Fudgios or have them in the house still. Shame!
You're so guilty that you only eat them in secret?
I only eat them in secret. I can't bring Fudgies in the house because I still feel guilty. And it's really sad. I feel shame. I'm ashamed. Shame. Yeah, I'd like to take this time to apologize to Leah Grillon, my friend, who I blamed the Fudgio incident on.
Here's Sophia Rae, co-CEO of Girl on Fire and producer and co-host of Mother-Daughter podcast, Spark.
Hi everyone, my name is Sophia Rae, and thank you so much for having me on your mental health talk show. Today I'm going to be elaborating on the subject of guilt and grief. I went through my own traumatic event back in April 2020, and it really was a fundamental event which shaped who I am today, and a lot of the projects that I work on to this date are surrounding mental health literacy, which is something that has become extremely important to me. I public speak in the school system about trauma and mental health. I also have a podcast with my mom, Jenny Kierstead. We talk about everything, especially mental health. And I also am co-CEO of Girl on Fire Empowerment. So the very first question that I'm going to be answering is, how did grief affect your day-to-day life? So for those of you who aren't aware, back in April 2020 in Nova Scotia, we experienced one of the largest mass shootings in Canadian history. It left our province in complete shock and immense grief, and the repercussions of this violent act do continue to haunt Nova Scotia to this day. They continue to haunt me. I lost my aunt, Lisa McCulley, in this mass shooting, and so this event really had a huge impact on me, especially because I underwent such an intense trauma at such a young age. I was only 13 when all of this went down. And so this is a really good question, because I find that the idea of grief is very interesting because we have an ideology of how we believe people should grieve. But I really did not present a lot of those qualities. I was very dissociated from the entire event. I was able to speak very openly about it without having a whole lot of emotions. And I've come to realize through a lot of therapy that I was dissociating and I was protecting myself by not allowing all of this intense emotion to really sink in and to really recognize the magnitude of the event that I was undergoing. And so grief affected my day-to-day life in very interesting ways. Because I wasn't outwardly dealing with it, it would come out in other ways. So I actually developed a very intense fear of COVID. And the root of this was me feeling out of control, me feeling like I didn't have power over the situation with my aunt, and I wanted something to control. So I became very hyper-focused on controlling my surroundings and controlling COVID. This was an aspect of how grief affected my day-to-day life. I wasn't thinking rationally. Grief also affected my day-to-day life in the experiences and the emotions of people around me. I was in quarantine when everything happened, and I dealt with my family being very traumatized and grieving with me in small quarters as we went through COVID isolation. And so for me, that was ultimately how my day-to-day life was affected. There was no outrunning the grief. I had to sit with it and I had to be present to it. So the next question is, how did I cope with the loss that I faced? And I think this really has lots of layers. I don't always cope effectively. I think no one really can, especially when faced with something that's so intense and so large. For me, I had to really dial into self-care because my mental health was really fragile at this time. I had to employ and learn a lot of practices on how to take care of myself. I had to learn how to prioritize self-care because this isn't something that came naturally to me. And so for me, what really helped just deal with the trauma and go from post-traumatic stress to post-traumatic growth was becoming in tune to what I needed as a person. So this could be doing short meditations, doing yoga practices. Going into therapy was a huge one for me. Also taking walks, taking breaks. These are all self-care tools that I employ to get through this difficult period of time. They don't immediately make everything better, but it helps make the feelings a little bit more bearable. And for me, it really helped integrate what I was feeling little by little so that I could then process it. Next question is, how do you feel like the grieving process affected you? And this is very layered as well, because I think it has given me a deeper understanding of life. It's given me more gratitude. I find that I now catch myself just recognizing everything that I have and how lucky I am to even be here today. There's a portion of me that is more introspective than I was before the event. I've come to really understand how my mind works and what I need to really work through intense emotions. I've come to understand a lot about myself. So there is positives to how the grief process has affected me, and there's negatives as well. I developed pretty intense OCD tendencies along with anxiety, and so these are just new things that live in my nervous system now that I'm learning to deal with. I think it's important to recognize that while I've seen a lot of growth, I've also been met with a lot of challenges, and I've learned that it's really about living in duality with both of these aspects and knowing that both of them will exist simultaneously. They don't cancel out one another, but to recognize the bad and the good will live with you on your journey. And so for the next question, what advice would you give someone who is grieving? And I find this question a little bit difficult to answer just because the grieving process is so difficult for everyone. But I think everyone grieves differently. There isn't a right or wrong way to do it. And understand that you might react differently than another person. And that's normal because we're all unique. We all have our unique experiences that we're bringing to the table. And so what I've learned is to really attempt to bring less judgment to the whole grieving process. It's not easy, but I think my main advice would just to be gentle on yourself, reach out for help if you need it, and really take care. Thank you, everyone.
Let's talk about some coping skills you can use to better your experience with guilt and grief.
Exercise is a great way to cope. From running a marathon to just taking a short walk in your neighborhood, physical activity can boost your serotonin, and it's just a good way to keep your mind at ease. Another great way to cope is journaling. Journaling gives you the opportunity to share your thoughts privately and gives you a creative outlet to reflect or just express your feelings with low pressure. Meditation can be a good way to slow down and take a break. It gives you a chance to reflect and gives new perspective to your life. Meditation isn't for everybody, but you'll never know if it's for you unless you try. Listening to music is probably the easiest way a person can cope. All types of music have their own soothing features to help ease your mind. Lastly, if your guilt or grief is really overtaking your life, you can reach out. There are several professionals in the area and online that you can speak to about your thoughts. There are free and paid options that keep counseling and therapy accessible to everybody. Don't feel embarrassed if you need to talk to a professional. It's more common than you think, and people around you care about you so much.
In the midst of grief, guilt often sneaks in. That feeling of looking back and wishing we'd done things differently or said certain things before the loss. It's like the weight of responsibility or regret hanging over us. Maybe it's about unresolved issues, unspoken feelings, or thinking we fell short in our relationship with the person who's gone. And you know what? This feeling adds a whole extra layer to the emotional roller coaster of grieving. For instance, someone might kick themselves for not spending more time with the person they lost or not letting them know how much they were appreciated. Unaddressed feelings of anger or regret can make the mourning process even more tangled, leaving us with this heightened sense of guilt. But here's the thing. It's okay to feel this way. It's part of the healing journey. Taking a step back, acknowledging these emotions, and giving yourself some grace is crucial. Reach out to friends, family, or mental health professionals who can offer a listening ear without judgment. Everyone goes through the grieving process differently, so it's all about finding what works for you. And remember, self-compassion is key during these tough times. Thanks for watching Mental Health Mondays, and until the next time, Huskies, peace and love.